Serj Hunt and Seth Blaustein. Wow, two big brains in very different containers. And I know Serj well, and it was so cool to see him interact with Seth. They seemed like they had read a lot of the same books, and there was this sort of untangling, unfurling between the two of them with so much story. These two men have like such an innate natural ability to weave story and metaphors in a way that I've rarely seen, especially with two strangers. What do you think?
Hmm. Yeah, they were definitely storyteller extraordinaires, both in their own right, but then we could feel that come together. Very interesting to have this like mind melt between Austin, Texas, and London in the UK, where you can tell they both live in these potent, creative places in the world, these potent creative cities, and they're both also young men that show that you know the limitations of this world are not necessarily the limitations we need to put onto ourselves and what we're able to create
Mm,
for you know stories that they're telling, initiatives that they're running, the dollar donation club that Seth co-founded, that is like a new form of crowdfunding, Serj's initiatives around education and AI. There's a lot to learn in this episode. And
mhm.
all of our guests were rule breakers, but the way those two play with the rules to create space for innovation really impressed me. And that's why I call them both friends. It just, yeah, speaks to my heart.
Yeah. And you are going to leave this episode with a whole list of resources, books to read, quotes that you want to put in your pocket for later. Highly enjoyable. You won't want to miss this. We are breaking the rules of business as usual. Join this exclusive Alter Braintrust series with Hope and Julian. I feel like you both are futurists in some way. And as you break the rules and pioneer new paths, a new future, what does this future look like that you're working towards? Could you paint a picture of the impact you hope your work will have on the world? Let's start big. Go ahead, Seth. Do you want to begin?
Oof, man, you teed up a big one there. Sure. Yeah, I mean, this is something that I think a lot about as both a filmmaker, storyteller by background, and how that's evolved for me into, how do we storytell the future and make it more of the present, right? And so in a past company incarnation, I ran a conference festival called Future Frontiers, and it was a futurism event essentially. And um, what our intention with the event was to find people kind of on the frontiers who were sort of bringing the future to the present, right? And doing it in a practical way. It wasn't just kind of lofty, sci-fi. It was really practical, but kind of radical innovation. And how do we present them in a way that it feels like that future is happening now? So we would do that by blurring the lines of between fiction and reality. We had this fictitious host from the future who was kind of introducing the speakers as like, these are, vectors towards a better world, right? And so that's this theme, kind of the question, the way you phrase it is actually very much how I like to think about entrepreneurship and what we create in the world, right? Is you're building storylines, right? You're building kind of vectors towards a particular type of outcome. And so and one of the, we kind of loosely call, I don't know if it's maybe a little too serious to call it the futurist law, but we kind of thought about it as a team as this futurist law is sort of that throughout history, there's always people on the fringes and frontiers who are thought of as crazy initially, who then become the mainstream and the boring mainstream eventually of the next generations. And so if that's a law throughout history, which it pretty much is, right? There's always some fringe thing that then, even the Wright brothers with flight, like people were publishing scientific papers after the point that they'd proven flight just because of how slow information moved. People were proving mathematically that it was impossible, right? And so, but they'd done it already. And so, this is throughout history. And so we have to know that every moment in history, we're in a point where we know that there's something that's considered crazy that is actually going to be the thing that you're going to, is going to be the boring mainstream of the next generation. And so that is a humbling recognition to have. And so that was kind of the premise of the event, and sort of how I like to think is like, what's out there now that is, with an open mind, open heart, that is actually an improvement to human civilization and to our expression as a species. And how can we go find that, and how can we be active participants in building it, rather than just kind of digesting, whatever is the default programs that we've kind of been born into. And so, for us, and I'll try not to make this like a too lengthy response, but that's kind of how I like to think about it. Storytelling is the best technology I've ever discovered for how to create better futures. We build everything in the world, the entire civilization, from our consciousness. And our consciousness is really driven by story archetypes, symbols, images, story. And so, what are we creating? What stories are we telling? Right? Those stories unfold into the way we form government, the way we form money, the way we form medicine, the way we form educational systems, like what Serj is creating, right? So all of these things come from our consciousness, our stories. And what stories are we telling now that are going to bring us on a storyline, on a story arc that we want to be on? Right. And so I think that's a really important conversation, is like, what archetypes are we actually tapping into? Are we building on an angry storyline, or are we building on a loving storyline? Right. And so for me as an entrepreneur, and doing whatever my part is as being a storyteller into the world and helping to create, hopefully, loving, compassionate, kind vectors for the future. My company, Dollar Donation Club, which is it's a collective of, about 17,000 people who give together, with this principle of unified giving, right? Whether you can give $1 a month or $100 a month, it doesn't matter. It's about us behaving sort of more like a school of fish that gives small amounts every month, but together create these kind of like mega donations. And they go to highly specific, highly targeted, proven solutions to big existential challenges, like environmental, social challenges. And that's, the way we look at that is, everybody can participate, whether you're an 8-year-old who gives $1 of her allowance, which we have on the, we have many of those as members, or you're a 75-year-old, it doesn't matter. Everyone can join the hero's journey of discovering what we can really do when we actually unify. Right. And there's a whole kind of backstory to how this started, but that's kind of the punchline. And that's the hero's journey that I'm most fascinated with, is how do we actually use entrepreneurship as a storyline that people can participate in, that we can all participate in, and be the heroes of our own story, not just as individuals, but as a collective species and as a collective civilization. So
Ooh,
that was like pretty
that.
cerebral answer to your question.
No, there's so much to unpick there, and what I really deeply resonate with is the intergenerational aspect of your story. It relates to everybody, and I look forward to diving in further with you. Serj, I know that you are a storyteller. I've seen it in action, and you're also one to ask big questions. So I wonder how you want to tackle what kind of future you're working towards, and how is your work making an impact on this?
Yeah, I'll tee it up with how I think about futures, and I'll sort of add a punchline of what that looks like specifically for my work. How I think about it is that humans are basically idea to reality creatures. We turn ideas into reality. We use art, science, and engineering as a kind of flow of information from the imagination to real matter. And art is making the ineffable effable. Science is running experiments to make ideas realistic. and then engineering is making them real. So it's sort of a flow that all humans can participate in to do that. And I guess the specific way that I imagine the future being more fun, or what I'd like to see more of, is uncapping that process for more and more people, uncapping that creativity so they can help unlock that creativity in others. The human journey is a creative one, and we come up with all sorts of inventions like planes and monetary systems. And so really the work I do with education is not really about, educating someone about a specific time in history, and that's important, but more so it's a process of unblocking. And in an age of AI and augmented reality, the distance between mundanely living and profoundly learning is closing. The imagination and reality are overlapping a lot more, and I think that's really the world I want to see more of, is one where those two worlds interplay much more quickly at a higher feedback rate, and idea can be moved to reality much quicker.
And with that, your go ahead, Julian. You dive in.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just excited that Serj, you started touching on the digital landscape and both maybe the potential to get lost in the digital, but also the potential for it's kind of groundbreaking ways of creating connections between people across the world. And I think one thing that's often forgotten to be said, but I think we're only still like 3 billion people online out of 7, out of 7 to 8. So half of the planet is still not even in the digital space. But I want to know from both of you, because I know you're both actually, future frontiers leaders in that regard. Serj, you work with AI. Seth, you've hosted this conference for a long time. There's this collective giving platform that you've co-orchestrated. What were some of the aha moments for both of you when you realized what is actually possible in a digital space and how it ties back into creating a healthier world rather than just a digital dystopia? Did you have some of those in your childhood or along the journey where you're like, I see it?
Yeah, sure. So I think my major, it's both an insight and my maxim for optimism, is the same machinery that makes you susceptible to bullshit and self-deception is also the same machinery that can afford flourishing and wholeness. And the fact that you kind of have, every human has the potential in them for as much good as much bad, is the thing that keeps me hopeful. If you imagine technology as being something that puts more leverage on the bad mechanisms, the sort of parasitic processing, the narrowing of attention, the collapsing of awareness, we've built a lot of good stuff to do that. And then it's, military psychographic grade technology to target your nervous system. And we've built really, really amazing things to get you addicted to stuff. So my optimist maxim is basically that, well, the same is true for the good side. So we should figure out how to build that. And that's not necessarily always a case of just inventing technology, but also figuring out governance, incentives. It's not that that stuff's not possible, and there's tons of stuff to be hopeful for. We're just not very good at designing them or finding spaces that would incentivize them. So there's plenty of upside to explore and plenty of wide open creative space for a powerful integration of technology and human technology, the biological computer that we are.
Yeah, I totally agree about like technology just augments what's already there in consciousness. And so you can take it and do horrible things. And just like, the old maxims about like money doesn't change you, it just exposes more of what, it just augments the signal that was already there. Um, so I think that's very relevant these days because, as technology, the knob is getting cranked up, it's exposing a lot more capability of things that might have not been able to be expressed at a high signal rate are now like very visible. But that can go for the good side as well, right? Imagine, using virtual reality to create horrific scenes that scare the shit out of you, or creating like divine experiences, or you feel, you feel, a deep oneness, you feel a deep sense of love and compassion for other humans. We are the technology. There is no getting around that one way or the other, right? What we have inside is what we express outside as the tools, the technologies. And so at the end of the day, there's no outsourcing that, right? Like there's nothing that will ever be more important than the human technology, beyond biological, even to, right, what is the spiritual technology that we are employing? What is the what is our true capacity as aware beings that are sentient and that are capable of creating? And that technology is, I believe, always going to be more important and more powerful ultimately than even the incredibly amazing things that are emerging with AI. And but with that said, just to keep on the theme of storytelling, like there's amazing things, like there's this thing called the Portal. It's a Shared Studios is the company. They basically take a shipping container, and they, what they did is they had one in New York City and Manhattan, and they put one in, I forget where, somewhere in Africa. And they set up a dinner table, and there's a HD monitor on one side of the shipping container. You go in, it's pitch black in there, but there's a monitor, and it feels like you're at a life-size representation with the people in the other portal, right? And so 6 people in Manhattan had dinner with 6 people in Ghana, or I'm not sure where it was, but it was an African continent country. And it's like, from a storytelling perspective, that's really incredible, right? Because we know, if you've ever traveled around the world, the power of travel to expose you to new ways of thinking, to expand your ability to have compassion for other ways of life. And so to be able to then bridge that digitally, thanks to technology, where we can actually see more of each other, right? Like we're mapping our heart to more of what is the fullness of the human experience through a tool like that has a benevolent outcome. And so things like that, I mean, are really beautiful. And so from a storytelling perspective, I think there's so much amazing things that we can do to build the human technology, the consciousness technologies that we wield, through kind of some of these amazing physical things that we can create.
Seth, can I lean in on the storytelling? Actually, for both of you, all 3 of you. Maybe we could do, rather than travel in a portal, we could time travel. I am hearing both of you talk about your consciousness and your awareness of human technology, as well as the work you're doing as entrepreneurs, as futurists. Do either of you, or all 3 of you, have a story when you were little Seth, little Serj, little Julian, when you became aware of your awareness? Was there a point where you were feeling like, oh, wow, like, yeah, I have dreams, I have goals, and I want to have a spiritual thread in my life that clearly is still thrumming with you right now in a big way, and you're weaving it into your work? I'd love to hear those stories. That's a big
Yes.
one.
I'll jump in. I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think part of, like, when I was 12, I realized I wanted to be a filmmaker. It was just super clear. So something about storytelling was already very active for me, about, you can represent reality in unique ways. Right. And so that's actually kind of a spiritual concept. If you think about it, it's like, this is the way you see reality. How you structure your perspective, your consciousness dictates what you will create. So at a young age, maybe around 16, 17, I had this sense that we're living in an illusion, and that this world is kind of an illusion on some level, and that we have so much more potential inside of us that is not being seen. Right. And it was a very personal experience. It's like, I know I have a lot more than what people are seeing. Right. So that must be what is happening to everybody. And so that, you take that a step further. It's like, well, what would the world be like if, all of that was out here, all of our potential, all of our beauty, all of, like, the creative force within us was actually fully expressed. So that became a very fascinating thing for me. And then on a more kind of practical level, and I think this could tie into Serj's work in interesting ways. For me, it was actually education where I had sort of an awakening, I would say, like a first stage sort of waking up to the depth of illusion that actually occurs in the world. And basically what happened when I was a junior or senior in high school, I had a great radical friend who's, you know, graffiti artist, and he exposed me to some books about the where public school in the United States came from. Right, it's this guy John Taylor Gatto. A short book called Dumbing Us Down, another longer book about the history of American education. And basically what I learned was, wow, this system was created to power the Industrial Revolution. It is a system that is not intended to create creative people, or to nurture creative people, I should say. It's kind of the opposite. It was like to kind of squelch creativity, focus more on, rote tasks, following specific, regimented orders. You don't want to be creative on the assembly line, right? That's not the outcome that you want. And it wasn't really conspiratorial. It was sort of like, this is what we need for the Industrial Revolution. We need obedient workforce. So we took a Prussian system that was designed for military, essentially, and adapted it into the UK, and then from the UK to the US. And, we still have that system in the United States that is still predominantly the public compulsory schooling model that we use. But the point is that when I became aware of that, I remember graduating from high school and like having this feeling like I was just being birthed out of an organ of civilization. And I was like, whoa, like someone designed this for specific reasons that I was totally unaware of. Right. And yeah, it's got an effect on me as a person, the way I think. Like there's no question that it's affecting. And I always felt like I hate school. And I kind of associated school with learning. Like I hate learning because school, education, it's all the same, right? And but I had this feeling of like, wow, I'm inside a fishbowl that I didn't see the walls of. And this fishbowl was called school. Right. But it made me start thinking like, oh, wow, I can see the fishbowl walls a little bit all of a sudden. Right. There's an awareness expansion happened. That led me to, the next, I'm still on the trajectory of like, what other fishbowls am I inside of? Right? What's government? Where did that come from? What's the philosophy of medicine? What's the philosophy of money? Like what fishbowls do we live inside of? And the biggest one, right, is like the universe itself. Like what are the illusions of the sensory experience of reality that we take for granted and that we just assume are reality, and they are not. They are actually perceptions. And so this is for me, that was kind of like a key point in my own story of like, what fishbowls, it's always a good question to be asking, like, what am I taking for granted? What's been sort of default programmed here? And it's not, I think I used to have a bit more of a like, oh, like break that, like disrupt that bullshit, they're feeding me in the matrix, whatever. Like, but really this is just the unfolding of civilizations, the unfolding of consciousness. It's like, it's okay on some level, right? It's just part of the process, but we should become aware of what illusions we're living in, what fishbowls we're in, who designed, like there's that famous Steve Jobs riff where he's like, everything you see was created, right? Like everything you see, somebody had the idea for. That's so true. You look around the room you're in, wherever you're listening to this from, like the table, the dog, water bowl, the microphone, the computer, these are all things that came out of our awareness. They came from a story. They came from the substrate of our consciousness. And so like, what created that? What story? What are the roots underneath those stories? Are they opening and for flourishing, or are they to create some kind of economic output, like that might not be in your best interest? And so anyways, that's it, kind of how that came up immediately when you asked the question, is that arc of my own personal story.
That's some awareness for sure. And Serj, I know we've spoken about this, I think when we first met, and I'm curious
Yeah.
what stands out for you.
I like this theme of like illusion. That makes sense. I guess, another part I don't normally add to the story is that I always grew up with a slight synesthesia. So I'm dyslexic, and uh, words have colors, music has colors. And so the idea that like what I see and what you see are different, and that we don't see the same reality was always like a kind of given when I was younger. Um, so that always led me to poke at like, okay, well, what's stable here, and what's like a projection of the mind. So those were always big questions. If there's sort of specific spiritual experiences and stuff, there were plenty sat in the woods. I used to live in nature, so my aesthetics are normally like English countryside, and plenty of wood muck arounds would relate to have profound sort of like moments with trees and bits of nature, and sat on logs. But I definitely think there was one experience which always really captivated me and scared me a lot, actually, which was sometimes sat around at home or just before bed, there would be a sort of intense collapsing of awareness, almost as if it went through a pinpoint and sort of expanded infinitely out the other side. I can't really put a pulse on it until I spoke to some folks about jhanas and non-dual states, if that's terminology that's relevant to anyone. But it tended to felt like annihilation. I wasn't there, and I wasn't there infinitely, which was kind of scary. So I didn't really have context for that in my multi-faith family. I had Hindu family, I had Muslim family, Christian family, Buddhist family, and so none of them really had a good pulse for like what that was. Um, Actually, the Buddhists had a better sense of what that was, and so that resulted in me sort of asking big questions and poking around, being a bit of a little shit, asking priests what the meaning of life was.
How dare you ask a priest what the
I
meaning?
Yeah, badass.
What about you, Julian?
Well, I'm curious how that went, Serj. What did he say? What came back?
Mostly Bible quotes.
To be expected. To be expected.
I'm going to refer to the book. Yeah.
Now I'm curious. So you have Hindu family, and what was the other side?
Muslim family, Buddhist family, mixed in with tribal. Like my mother's Malaysian, but from a specific tribe in Malaysia. So the sort of shamanistic roots and stuff. But
Wow.
my dad's Christian.
Where was that you spent the time in nature? You had those experiences.
Just in like, we grew up around Andover or Basingstoke in England. It's just pretty boring parts of England. But yeah, just we had like a woodland around the corner, and just sat around there. Really, I used to just muck around, make dens and climb trees. Really,
without screens. You had a fair amount of nature and boredom.
Yeah, lots of boredom in nature. I didn't really have a phone till I was like 17 or something. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
What about you, Julian?
Yeah, this is interesting. I think the theme of boring countryside in England has shown up multiple times now across the series of breaking the rules. There must be like a magic ingredient that humans get in a bored state in nature. I have a few memories. I'm like debating in my mind which one to share. I'm going to go with the most mundane one. A moment I remember becoming aware of my awareness was we're a group of boys, and my best friend's cousin was in town. I think I've never shared this story ever. And, we were like 6 or 7 or something. And we were like outside playing around. And he suddenly had this genius idea to trample down an anthill. And everything about that was somehow in my body like the worst idea ever. It's like, you can't do this. Like fuck you, And so he did, kind of as a reaction to me, and then everyone turned on me. Meanwhile, he just killed like 100 ants with his foot as a 7-year-old. And everyone turned on me in the group, which was really weird. I probably never experienced that to this point. And something about the experience, they all ran off and they were like, well, whatever they said in whatever German that we spoke at the time. And I just remember it so much. I was just standing there and was like, well, wait a second though. I think I think it was okay for me to say this. And so there's this moment of an awareness, of a larger awareness of a moment where something wrong was happening, where I just had to own my position, even though socially it was definitely like a loss on that day, or for the next couple of days. That was one moment, pretty mundane, but somehow really meaningful. It just came back to me. Serj, I also really relate to the colors thing. I remember we talked about this so much in like whatever, like first, second, third grade. Sometime then it was like, how do I know you see what I see when I say blue? And we just, we would just back and forth philosophize about that. We just don't know. Like, we just really don't know. I mean, you say blue and I know what blue means. And then you point at the wall and we both say this means blue. But do we know what I see? Do you know what you see? Like, so that was definitely one of those. And then relating to this more mature version that Seth, that you shared, like 12, 13, when it like really clicks in, right? Like you're a product of a society and you're suddenly emancipating into like hormones and teenager and realizing I'm about to need to be a part of some of this. Which part of that do I actually agree with? And so I got really lucky. I would say this was like a spiritual initiation without anyone forcing me onto it. But I had this desire to want to go abroad at that age. And long story short, my parents supported me. It took another 2 years. And then when I was 15, I went to Paraguay in South America. And I stayed a full year, learned Spanish, learned Portuguese. And it just bombed my perception of reality. In fact, it was the first time I was ever outside of my parents' home for such a long time, right? And so, yeah, I basically also had this moment when I saw this school system is an interesting joke. And these teachers are like, they think they know everything about life, but I was just abroad for a year in a third world country, another continent, learned 2 languages. I can't trust these teachers anymore. They don't have the same amount of life experience than me. And so it was quite arrogant from society's perspective of where a teenager can hang out. So I had to deal with that and kind of reintegrate like what's appropriate to say and whatnot. But I just knew I can't really trust anyone anymore. And I got to figure out my own way, because like unless they've been abroad and gone to another country and understood that, I probably won't listen to them anyway. And so that was the beginnings of like how my life started to shape. And Serj, back to you there. I think you were divinely set up for like this intercultural mix, right? Where these questions just will come up. But Hope, we didn't hear from you. So how about you?
Yeah, I was quite young. I would say I too was in England and in London proper. And I was at a co-op school in a house near Kew Gardens, if you know where that is, Serj. And part of the school. And I had an awareness that everybody was in this pattern, this flow. I started to see everybody doing the same things, and grown-ups doing, jobs in the same way, and children going to school at this, in my cohort. And I could just see the unfolding if I stayed in that track, if that makes sense. And it did not feel me. And I started to look out for other, like keenly be aware of, is there a way for me to jump out of this into another path, another track? And I had some cousins who went to school in the south of England, and it was a bit Harry Potter style. You had to hop on a train and with a trunk and leave your family goodbye. And at 6, I remember feeling very resolute. Like, I love my family. I didn't have to leave, a chaotic family. They were great. They were grounded. The school, nothing wrong with the school, but I felt like I needed to see the world in a different way than the track that I was on. And so I worked on my parents for 2 years straight. And that was the beginning of my negotiation of life, and finally won them over. And I ended up on that train at 8 with my trunk, and ended up going to an amazing school and opening all sorts of fun, creative portals and interacting with kids from around the world who had different realities, who had different systems, questions. And I would say that I started to feel the opportunities that are afforded if you're brave to push for what you want. even from, the age of 6. I think my parents thought, oh gosh, we're in for it now. She's starting at 6. And looking back, I'm getting closer to 50. Looking back, I see that muscle I have flexed over the course of my life. And I've done it with my own kids, pulling them out of school, taking them all over the world. And it makes me think of being brave to do things differently. And I've spoken to Serj about this a lot. I've actually introduced my daughter to Serj. And it's pretty amazing to be able to expose young people, or actually anyone at any age, to brave people willing to put their asses on the line to do things differently. And I guess my question from my flexing of being brave to do things differently, breaking the rules in some ways. I'll start with you, Serj, and I'd really like to hear what you are learning from being around young people who are breaking the rules, who are taking huge chances to be out of the system, and perhaps some educators who are stepping outside of this fishbowl, as you say, Seth. They've seen the fishbowl too. The kids have seen the fishbowl. What are you learning from them? What's inspiring you? What's lighting you up? I'd love to hear.
Yeah. So what's inspiring about young people who have come out of the fishbowl and have some kind of
Yeah.
awareness? Maybe there's a comment about Gen Z broadly, and then specifically about ones who have managed to get out of the fishbowl. Gen Z are really interesting because the employers are kind of scared of them because they don't feel like they can sit them down on a chair for long enough to do the boring thing. And so this is like an aversion to getting Gen Z into the workforce. Gen Z also have kind of untethered from normal historical roots like work culture, like traditional work culture, and many of the memes that like boomers and Gen X, like my gen, are like care about. They also just have made their own thing. So they're weirdly like in this thing where they don't really have a certain future, and they don't really have a tethered historical ground. So they don't have a shared narrative with a lot of the other generations. Like I still grew up with a Walkman. I felt like all the changes of different like formats and the digital age was just kind of really kicking in. So in a sense, I felt like a continuity to my reality, whereas many of Gen Z have known just like screens and memes and these kinds of worlds. So they're untethered at both ends. And I think this is both their like curse and their biggest upside, which is the ones who have like cut free and have found whatever they call like purpose, mission, their vision for the world. I think they'll be fine. Like, I think they're happy. They have all the leverage they need. They actually have lots more opportunities to kind of reimagine themselves. There's lots more flexibility in their identity. Too much can be bad, but there is at least a much more higher chance that they can do that. So that's my sort of like hope for the ones who have cut free, and so much possibility for them to just like disrupt systems, think differently, go a different direction, right? So that's my big hope for them. And then, another thing I'm learning is, young people like learning from young people. They don't want to be told by anyone like much older than them what to do. So when they see YouTubers who have made it and they're doing something cool, they'll do what the other cool kids are doing. And there's just so much opportunity for them to do that I'm really inspired by the ones who cut free and realize like, oh yeah, I can do things differently. I've started a business at 16. I traveled when I was younger. Or maybe like I dropped out of school because of COVID and now I'm like doing something else. If there's leadership within that age group, really solid leadership, I really think there's a new generation of leaders coming, and they'll all be like AI leveraged, very much more like sensitive to the social, emotional, geopolitical, planetary nervous like sense of that. They'll be more tapped into that. So I think there's a new wave of really amazing young leaders that's brewing, and they'll be the ones to bring more of like Gen Alpha into the fold. But it starts with them. Like I don't see anyone like watching Rishi Sunak and being like, God, I want to be like that guy. Um, I love Rishi, he's doing a good job, but for the young people, they need to see other young people thriving.
Yeah. And I wonder for you, Seth, are you working with young people? Do you have Gen Z, millennials woven in? I know you said that you had some young donors in the Dollar Donation Club, but how are you seeing young people come up and stake their zone?
Yeah. Well, we definitely have a lot of members of Dollar Donation Club who are Gen Z or young, even younger. I don't know where the cutoff is exactly. With is Gen Alpha the next one? I didn't even know that.
My son
Um,
is Gen Alpha.
Where's
Yeah,
that start? Like, what's the upper
12.
ceiling age?
They're around 12 right now.
I'm learning.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I guess just from where I can speak to some relevance of it from the perspective of impact and kind of the expression of purpose and meaning in the world, as a storyteller, like to me, the fundamental tenet is you have to deeply respect the viewer's perspective, no matter who they are, right? You start a story and you degrade or you somehow disrespect someone's lived experience, then you kind of lost them at the beginning, right? And so I have a deep fascination with just understanding people. What I've noticed is, and from a philanthropic impact lens, is that the older generations that are living today, right? They looked at kind of impact and giving back and philanthropy as sort of like, oh, I do this quietly. I don't want to be seen for this. I do it anonymously. Like this is something that is not my main thing, but it's like, here's a thing that I'm going to like give a percentage or something separately. Like it was like a secondhand thought in a way. It's not to degrade it, is important, but there were some higher hierarchical need priorities, for the older generations. And now we're in a point in history where a lot of the base needs of the hierarchy are fairly stable, right? Like it generally. I mean, there's problems that have come with that, but yeah, most, in the West at least, like a lot of people are for the first time having this ability to not have to worry too much about what they're going to eat today. In fact, it's in some cases the opposite, right? It's like obesity is the problem more than food scarcity. So but one of the things that I notice on the other end of the spectrum, Gen Z and below, is like impact as identity, right? So it's not I do this separate, I do my work and then I'm going to give a little bit back. It's like that idea is kind of foreign, right? It's like, no, I am the expression of the good in the world, right? That is my identity. You can call it the aspirational identity of the younger generation. Is like I am the expression of that. And so giving back is not a aside. It's a this is who I am, and I want to be seen for it actually because like I want to show who I am. I want to flourish and express who I am. So and that's a beautiful thing. And some people might call that virtue signaling as a negative, but virtue is not a bad thing to signal. Right. It's like sometimes you talk about this idea of virtue signaling. It's like if it's really virtue, it's not a bad thing to signal, right? If it's fake, if it's kind of, for your ego, if it's for trying to show, of course, that's like a separate thing. I'm talking about real expression of I care about the world, I care about others. And it's not a terrible thing to be seen and acknowledged for. So we see that in Dollar Donation Club. We see, we have leaderboards and you kind of track you can level up, you can see how many trees you've planted, how many pounds of ocean plastic you've removed. And I think, we do see that like it's more the younger generation emerging that embraces that, right? That they believe their legacy is not just about, I held this job for 60 years and, which was sort of the necessary focus and outcome of a past generation. Is now it's like my legacy that I want to die with is how much good did I actually do? Like how did I affect positive change? And so, yeah, that's kind of just an observation, I would say, of how it seems like consciousness is shifting generationally towards more of a deep identity around the giving back as the central thing, not a secondary thing.
Yeah, it can be a bit of a weight, though. I am noting, I don't know if you see this, Serj, too, a weight on younger people that I don't remember having at 12, 13, 14 of like, I need to have the energy and power to impact the world. I don't remember that at 12.
It's definitely coming downwards. I've seen more sort of social justice 16-year-olds than
Yeah,
ever, right? Like not many of
yeah,
my friends when we were 16 cared much for that. Like, um, I so it is coming down in age. I can see that being a stressor if there's not the right emotional support and community support around those young people. On if it doesn't, everything in balance, right? Like I think that's generally been a good thing. I hear more, at least, you know, not as far as woke, but meaningful conversations between young people about the state of the world. So that conversation is coming down. But you're right. I think that's going to lead to more stresses. It's going to lead to more like angst, especially in the social media arena of like, hey, these other people have
yeah.
already donated thousands of dollars. What am I doing? Or something like that. There's a lot more comparison going on. So that's one of the huge downsides to this all, yeah.
There's a lot more
And I
visibility
think
to all of it going on. Yeah, go ahead, Seth. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, like, I believe there's been, a bit of a failure of storytelling on a civilizational scale around this too. And failure is maybe a strong word, but room for adjustment. We've really pumped the narrative for so long that the world is falling apart. Um, not out of incorrect, observations. Like there's things to raise the alarm bells on, but unfortunately, like the brain, it prioritizes negative information at basically 10x the priority of positive information. That's just neuroscience. Like the amygdala, it needs to prioritize threats, and so it does. And so we're in this world where now we've become so good at telling the story of how horrible things are getting environmentally and in other categories that a young mind is not quite capable yet of discerning between the perception story, right, which is a relative subjective expression of what's happening, and what's possible, right? And so, and throughout all of history, we hit existential things, right? Like, but the signal's so much higher now, like so much higher now, right? Where you're inundated with TikToks and the whatever's on the news. Like, yeah, it's going to drive people crazy, and it's going to create formative perceptions that are doomish, right? And yet there are amazing solutions out there. Like there really are solutions that exist right now that if they were scaled up and if they were iterated and would actually make obsolete a lot of things that we protest about. And so that's like, I wish for more narrative around, like, we need to do 10 times more positive, optimistic visioning than the negative. And we're doing like the inverse of that right now. And so, there's a kind of like a quote that was sort of central to the festival I ran, and it's kind of a personal, like, it's become a personal mantra, is criticized by creating, right? And it's loosely attributed back to Michelangelo. And it's the basic idea of, like, we put so much energy into criticizing and pointing out what's wrong. It's so fucking easy. Like, it's easy. It's lazy to point out what's wrong, even, right? And it's important, but it's not that hard, right? What's hard is, instead of throwing cans of soup at art, like, how do you actually channel that energy, that protest energy, into what could the world look like where this wasn't a problem? Like, what could that look like? Even if I have a crappy idea of what that might look like, what could that, like, how do I start chewing on the possibility of where, like, what would the world be like if I didn't feel this way? And like, what would exist that doesn't exist now? And then you start activating the creative principle, right? And channeling that energy into, how do we create? It's like Buckminster Fuller, right? Don't fight the existing reality, just create a new one that makes it obsolete, makes the problem obsolete. So I think as storytellers, it's not that we have a responsibility. It's like we have a choice to put a lot more into the beautiful possibilities of that are, and a lot of them are existing things, than the easy button of fear porn, which is so great for business models because it attacks your brain. It literally attacks your brain. You can't not prioritize it cognitively because it's so important to your existence from a survival perspective. But that's not a great thing to craft civilization from, right? Because we can end up in some weird realities if we keep going down the rabbit hole of storytelling horror rather than beautiful sci-fi.
Yeah, yeah, it's so well said, Seth. And you're kind of touching on it there with the criticize by creating. But I want to tap in like a level deeper for all three of you. Hope I definitely want to hear your point of view too about authenticity. So we're living in this highly complexified world with so much upside if you're able to create and generate the upside, right? Otherwise, it's a lot of downside because you're being dished up something else to consume every 5 seconds, and it will attack you in one way or other. So how do you stay centered? How do you unapologetically be yourself? How do you know what's you, what's not you? How do you three deal with this, especially in this world where, again, it's so easy to get lost in the digital?
Go stare at a fire for like 3 days in the woods somewhere. Honestly, I just think like the neural remapping that happens when you only drink spring water, and that's not what everyone can do, right? Like, but I do think it's the more and more I speak to folks who have made their money in tech and right at the top of designing the systems that screw us over, the more and more I see the pattern is like, just go camping, like unplug. It's not, I wouldn't say it's super hard, but it's a choice, and it's never too far, right? Unless you really can't get out to the countryside. Um, there's there's work expectations, there's school expectations, there's expectations everywhere. You just have to make a choice at some point to be like, I'm not going to participate in that. And I think that's like resetting is number one. If you can't connected to this, I've also just been poking at like how much free will humans have, like how much is it my gut telling me that I need, like the food I ate telling me to do something versus me making a choice,
Oof.
consciously. So I don't really know where that line
That's huge.
cuts
Yeah.
yet, but I'd like to believe in a world of free will. And connected to this is the idea of like hypnosis. Like many people are just on autopilot, and that's not really like they didn't choose to be there. They kind of have got in a loop. Hope you mentioned this, like there's just a pattern unfolding and some people are swimming that direction. Um, so there's a hypnosis on most people, which is spun by their friends, spun by their parents, spun by social media. And I don't think you get to make better choices if you stay in the same environment. I think you just have to change the environment that you're in first, like go to nature, or like don't have a phone around you, or don't be at that school, right? Don't be in that abusive relationship. So you change the environment, you change the human. So that's how I at least try to stay regulated in a world full of all of this stuff. I recommend more people do that where they can, really. Yeah.
I totally relate. Definitely nature. I have moved from living in cities around the world to a very small town in Quebec. Never thought I would live in a teeny tiny town surrounded by lakes and mountains. But I would echo the changing of your container. And for me, it's coming into community with very different people all the time. I seek it out, and that's part of my pattern of staying real. Hope is to check myself every time I'm with new people. Um, I try my best to be with people of all different ages as well. I think for me, the intergenerational transfer that happens when I can be with 8-year-olds, I can be with 16-year-olds, I can be with 50, 60, 70-year-olds. It leaves me with questions about where I might have ideologies that I didn't really see before, or where I might be holding on to something really tightly or wound up that I need to calm down. I check myself, but in the face of other humans. my insatiable curiosity to understand and learn about other people just drives me to try my best to show up as myself.
Yeah, I think, your question is like authenticity. Like, you can be authentic to a fake version of yourself, right? And so to me, like what you're really more deeply asking about is like, how well do we know ourselves? Like, who are we? And how in integrity and aligned is our behavior to that expression of the true or truer self, I'll say. And so, I think that's a factor. Like, to the degree that you can be authentic is a factor of how well you know who you are. And so, what are the ways to learn more of the differentiation between you and the programs and the default patterns of civilization, society that have been kind of imputed into you, let's say, right? So, um, and I think there is no better, like, I totally agree with what you guys are saying. Like, you actually can you can get there remarkably quickly to a space, to some stillness, some separation from the walls of the fish bowls through just space. Like, and nature is remarkably effective at that, right? It's like, we live in a world where we're in, those programs that, those programs and default things that, they're constantly pinging you. You're constantly getting pinged, and you're constantly being asked to consider or deflect them. And so, like, the hypnosis theme is really interesting. Like, I think about it almost more like mentalism, right? If you've ever seen a great mentalist, like how they create a perception, they create a lens, they create a framing. That's happening, right, on a civilization scale, with Hollywood, with movies, with news, with content and TikTok. Like, we're being invited. It's not necessarily a conspiracy. It's like we're just being invited into an inundation of, this is the way you should see it. 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 Right. And so it's actually like pretty fucking hard to find differentiation when you're constantly being barraged. And so, you can do it. It's just hard. You got to know how to meditate really well. You got to have some certain practices to be able to see it when it's happening and feel a space between you and it. And that takes a lot of practice. But going to nature, touching your feet to the earth, to the water for more than an hour, right? Like, for days, like, the camping, I think it really does. It's remarkable, actually. Like, it's amazing how quickly your own divine intelligence can kick back in, to where you're like, what was that I was doing? Like, what was that thing I was thinking? Like, that wasn't me. That wasn't my thought. That was, something else. And yeah, it doesn't take that much. So I think I totally agree with that. And there's a great set of books back there called The Ringing Cedars of Russia, that I think, Julian, you and I have already talked about this before, right? But there's a great set of themes in those books about exactly this, right? About exactly the importance of space, like, with a pause around it, space. And you really need to see how much of our world is not spacious in the world of podcasts, and what we're like, the world that we're all in as entrepreneur. And like, there's not a lot of space, right? And how do you create some space, some actual space, where there's not this influx of data, phone signals, notifications, like,
Well,
and it's
let me
really,
answer, Seth.
so
Yeah, no,
simple.
I love all of these answers, and I'm so glad we went like a bit deeper into the rabbit hole. You're right. Like, right now we're creating a product, and everyone who is watching it is in it right now, probably on your phone or on your computer, and there's 6 other tabs open. At the minimum, there's emails coming in, and you're probably in a city and you're getting pinged with your sports news and whatever. We all know that feeling. My follow-up question here is more about, designing the future, storytelling about the future, the more beautiful world we know is possible, the healthy planet that we know we were born on and we want to maintain. How do you all see this, in the sense that I was just camping, I fucking loved it. There's one person there that was just 5 days ago. She was like, turn off your phone. And I'm like, what do you mean turn off my phone? I was like, I'm on my phone. And then 2 days later, she kept repeating, turn off your phone, and said, turn off my phone more often than usually. And plus I was camping, so I really disconnected. is in Bacalar, south of Tulum, like total nature oasis, like absolutely reset, made a little fire, all of the things you can imagine. It was glorious. And then I drive back to Playa del Carmen, where I'm sitting right now. And the moment I arrive, I feel all of this uncomfortable pressure coming back literally onto my shoulders. And I got my practices.
You were aware?
Yeah, I was really aware of
You were
it.
aware?
Exactly. I got my practices. I got my things to do. I know how to deal with it. So as an individual, sure, I can deal with any of this. I can make good choices, especially if I don't eat that food that tells me to, eat more of that food. And like that was a great little side note there, Serj. But as a collective, like we're literally, and I was actually wrong, I just pulled it up. There's actually 5 billion people online now. We're covering the entire planet with signals. Anywhere you go, there's more signals and signals and signals and signals. So we're actually, Seth, to your point of creating space, we're eliminating the space that is naturally there. So as the storytellers of the futurists, and those of us that are like from the future, creating the future, what are we going to do about it? Like, I'm not against tech and technological upgrades and like progress. I think there's a line, but I don't really know how we're going to deal with all of that gunk that's currently here and these density spaces. What do you all think about that? Serj, you got a clear opinion brewing, yeah?
I have a couple angles, I guess. Like,
Yeah.
one is more like a technology solution. Another is more like a on the personal level and group level, I guess. On the technology front, I have no idea how this will catch on, how far it will extend. But has anyone seen the Humane AI pin? It was made by a company called Humane. It's basically something the size of this, which clips onto my jacket.
Oh yeah.
So, I've been dying for this screenless phone revolution to happen. My undergraduate was in sort of screenless human-computer interaction, and so this to me is like, great. I want one like yesterday. And I don't know how far that goes, but in the same way, you've got kind of like a movement towards dumb phones. Dumb phones are cool and they're sort of a rebellious move, but I also think like screenless phones are also just really great. It's a softer type of augmentation that doesn't require narrowing of focus into a specific locus of attention. And there's kind of I hope there's a way to still be in the fields, to still be in the internet, to still have computation around us, to have social media, to have expectations around us, but it's a much calmer tech and a screenless tech that we can inhabit. And I think there's definitely technological progress that way. So you can imagine like a small area of AR and screenless voice activated stuff. Calm technology to me seems like a way we can have the best of both worlds. There's plenty of papers on calm technology. It's a bit of a meme across designers, so check out calm technology. And ubiquitous computing was the other big thing that was, that was the other meme around having computation around us, but not taking up our eyeballs all the time. And so I'm hopeful for that technological direction. I think we can get there. The other part to do, like, I'll come from the story of you re-entering society, Julian, that to me, on like an individual and group level, either from like competent adults around you or some deep, conviction you build in yourself. Another part of authenticity, we talked about like stripping back, right? But I think there's also the component of maintaining authenticity. One way I think about that is generally around courage. And, you spoke to this as well, Hope. Like, you had this authentic impulse and then you had some bravery to go and do this thing. And courage was weird because I always used to think of, until a friend told me this other angle on courage, which was courage on one side is to do, he read Courage for Dummies or Confidence for Dummies. And, everyone was like, what would you learn from that? But one side of confidence and courage is I believe in myself. I'm capable. I can do this. You have your practices, Julian, right? Everyone's got their set of practices they can do. Another side to courage and confidence, this deep trust in the world, is that I can give myself to other people. And that's not normally thought of, right? And is best like illuminated when you think about the courage to give yourself to intimate partner, right? There's a self-confidence you can have, like a bravado and like, oh, I believe in myself. But the other aspect of staying authentic is like, can I trust giving myself to my community, to friends, to my family, right? And so there's the technological angle I'm hopeful of, and there's the social technology, which is like, do you have trusting relationships you can give yourself to who will hold you accountable to the practices that you said you're going to do, and don't load you with the expectations that um, will cause you that stress, that collapsing of awareness again. So social technology and a technological angle, I hope.
I think so. I guess like just reiterating in my mind, your question is sort of about like this inundation culture that we sort of have. Like, how do we sort of, as futurists, creator, blah blah blah, how do we kind of help? You know, how do we bridge that into a world we want to be in? Was that kind of your question, Julian?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the question. And considering the spaces, like really dense, over-informed spaces we move through all the time, right? If you're in a city, like in an apartment, how many Wi-Fi signals are you picking up right now? You're probably from 30 people around you.
Right. So, I think the beautiful thing is that when you go stare at a fire or you go outside, like it is inherently blissful. It's autotelic, like you enjoy it. Right. And so there's always hope and there's people, right, all the time who are creating intentional communities or creating retreat spaces. Like the experience economy that's turning into the transformation economy is actually like creating more of these spaces in one way, whereas the noise sectors are getting bigger. There's also, I think there's this kind of other side of the spectrum where people are appreciating solitude as well, and they're creating more experiences and places for that, which is really fantastic. It's like to kind of like some of the things that came up, Serj, while you were talking. I was just thinking a bit about musings on like what's happening with AI and the fear that a lot of people are having around it, and I don't know what's going to happen, obviously. Like with my futurist hat on, I like to try to think like what's the potential futures and what are the inevitable futures, right? Like certain things, they kind of get to a point where it's like, that's kind of inevitable. It's inevitably going to happen. There's very few of those in the moment in the AI space. It feels like to me, as just my own perception of it. But what I've been thinking about a lot is we're of this kind of overarching fear narrative of like AI is going to kind of consume, things that humans do, basically. It's like a, simple way of explaining it. But going back to this conversation around authenticity, who we are, our identity, like a lot of, it's like, I'm a copywriter. If I say like, I'm a copywriter, that's what I do. I've been studying copywriting for, 20 years and I've been working in it. And now all of a sudden this AI can like write copy really fucking well, right? Like in a second, right? And I am a writer, so I've given it some prompts. I'm like, that's better than the thing I wrote, and so it's kind of good, now you imagine that playing out at scale, right? Okay, I'm a copywriter. This thing's better at me than copywriting on some level, right? I am a insert the blank. I'm a graphic artist. Oh shit, Midjourney can create amazing art, right? Like visual expressions in an instant. Now, and that kind of, there's one, I think the knee jerk reaction that we're seeing is this sort of like, that's terrible. We're seeing the death of writing. We're seeing the death of art. And on some level, yeah. But on another level, it's also going to give us an existential moment as a species to confront that that's not actually who you are. You are not a copywriter. You are not a graphic designer. You are a sentient being who's expressing himself as a copywriter, expressing himself as a graphic designer. It's not who you are. It's not the source of your real identity. And so as, this potential of AI to kind of eat up and do all these things that we thought was what made us who we are, there's a spiritual moment that can happen. There's a spiritual confrontation that can happen there where we actually as a species can say, wait a minute, that's who we all thought we were these identities of career, of action, of behavior in the world. Is that really who we are? Is that really what we're actually here for, what we're actually capable of? Is my life to be 40 years of copywriting and then retire? And then, like, is that it? Right. And I think that there's something, I get goosebumps when I get to this. It's exciting to me because spiritual evolution is the only evolution. And so it's fascinating to me. And what I wish for more is for more philosophers, more spiritual teachers that are not bullshit spiritual, like really embodied spiritual teachers, to be involved more in the conversations around AI, because we're hitting existential philosophical questions. And coders, God bless them, don't study this stuff. They're not, it's not to say that they don't, but in general, their art and their minds are not wrapping around jnana yoga and philosophy of existence and questions of meaning and purpose. And like, so we're kind of being driven in that future by like innovators, coders, but it's actually, we're going into a very philosophical, spiritual range of experience, and we're kind of missing the like spirit guides in a way. And so that, like, I don't know why that came up so much with your question, but it's like tying together this thing about authenticity, about, space, not having space or being inundated. Like some of these things we might find like we didn't expect it, but it's being inundated by something that's actually going to strip away who we are not really. Right. And maybe it's okay that machines can do that because that's not actually who you are as a spiritual being.
Absolutely.
So now you have more space. To be the creative, spiritual being that you really are.
This is so fascinating to hear both of your answers and how they kind of coalesce together. And between the four of us, all of a sudden, this kind of information wants to appear, right? Sometimes I teleport myself into the future and I look back at this time in our space, right? In our timeline, whatever, 2024, 2027, lots of prophecies about these timelines too. And I think whatever we'll see as singularity, it is a spiritual quest and question of evolution, 100%. It is very much the who are we really question. And then I think it will have to do with language as well. I'm curious about that. Hope, I know you're a language nerd. I think we will look back and remember, yeah, this is the way we used to talk before AI really appeared. And then this is this inflection point where suddenly our entire global language started to shift, slightly change. Maybe it's just single words, maybe it's entire phrases, because we're starting to understand ourselves differently. And therefore, the language we need to use to express what we actually want to express has to be a different language than the language we use to build the Industrial Revolution schooling system. And currently, all of the AI models out there are language-based models. No? So I'm curious, because this conversation has been on fire. What do you all think about that part? Yeah.
I'm keen to hear from Serj and Seth on. I do feel our language is shifting, and I also feel like you both are bridges in some way. Seeing you, Seth, lean into the screen, and you're like, you are fired up. You can feel this. You can see with AI coming online that you understand that people's identity is not a writer, is not an artist, is not a musician. And Serj, you are actively building with your creative prowess examples of people expressing themselves in all types of ways in a trusted environment. I'm curious how you both are seeing this shift happen, but how are you acting as bridges? How are you acting as catalysts for all of this? Because you both, I am singling you out. You really are incredible bridges, because many people aren't seeing this in the same way until they land in a space with someone like you both.
I want to try and track it back to language, but there was something that Seth said which was very important. So yeah, we're having to have this existential moment, like, what are we? It's one of my big research questions, like, what is a human? And we're all going to have to ask that question on a global level. And I'm going to set it up as there's Homo Deus, which was Yuval Harari's book. There's a sort of splitting of narratives, and then I'll hook it back to language, and what we learned about LLMs and what that like implication was, and mainly the work of like Azar from the Center for Humane Tech. So in Homo Deus, there was the sense that as we merged with technology, there would be sort of two splinter groups, and that's probably going to happen. We're much more reactionary. I hope that some multiple narratives unfold, but it seems like two polarities will emerge. One will be like pro merging with cybernetic interfaces and AI. I don't believe consciousness uploading is a thing, but we can get into that another time. So there's the kind of pro augmentation folks, and then there will be a really strong pull, primarily from like religious groups that like this is unethical and you shouldn't be doing this. You shouldn't be extending human life. You shouldn't be doing all this augmentation with technology. And so somewhere in the middle of that is going to be a lot of tension and new narratives cropping up. There are going to be new stories being told, people trying to swoon you into their new cult of like, hey, this is the way forwards, kind of post-religious techno groups showing up with sort of varying flavors of like augment or don't augment. And I think at the crux of all of this is the need to find, you were poking at this, Julian, new empathy through language. And that restoring that empathy is going to be very interesting because everyone wants something important and they're flaming over ideologies. So there's new language which needs to be established. And to hook it back to the LLMs thing, one of the deep insights of LLMs was basically that like everything is in a sense a language. Everything that is known is a language. The unknown is, even the known is what we can language is mappable to other languages in interesting ways. That's why we have text to video, video to text, speech to video, whatever you want to do. That's why we have these models. And so there's some very interesting work with Azar and who is the co-founder of the Center for Humane Tech, where they're basically building interfaces between humans and whale language and humans and elephant language. And we don't know how far that extends yet, but there's an insane spiritual component to that, which is, hey, we might be able to speak to animals and build empathy with all beings across all time and all space, but we have to get it right. We shouldn't be fucking up their like polluting their airwaves with our like death metal music or or like making whale songs, spinning whale narratives into human narratives and saying, oh, the whales are attacking the warboats, kill the whales, right? There's going to be a very delicate thing we have to face there as we do human to whale and whale to human, and realize that the pigs are screaming and saying, hey, why are we in the slaughterhouse? And someone's gonna have to explain that, by the way. We're representative. And so that the fact that LLMs do allow for cross language across not just human to human and like Chinese to English or like Arabic to English, but like being to being, this unlocks a whole new layer of empathy we need to like wake up to and get serious about. So the jobs will diminish. We won't know if we're a videographer or not, but that leaves you loads of wide open space to figure out like whale song, right? There's new frontiers of stuff being built right now. So I hope that we can find more empathy with LLMs.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a deep, deep question because language really is, it's the closest approximation to the actual expression of our consciousness. Not like a reference to, but that's it, right? It's like the way that there's a lot like Noam Chomsky's and a lot of this work is like how you think is your language. Your language is how you think, right? So it's your thought. It's actually your thought of consciousness. And there are limitations and possibilities of each language, right? Like English is a very linear language. It's very chronological, it's very linear. And that is why partially it's so good at kind of Western types of creativity and structure, order, but it's not that creative in a certain sense, right? And that's why and I don't remember to what degree it actually evolved, but it was suggested earlier in the AI development timelines that Sanskrit would actually be the best language to code AI in, because Sanskrit has a very modifiable creative capacity to it. You can modify the endings, the beginning, like you can kind of Lego, and therefore you can, Lego meaning together in ways that are not so concrete. And so it's like almost more creative in that you could create something new, a new expression that didn't maybe exist before through the use of that language. Um, and so, we're confined and liberated by the language that we use, right? Like you actually can't have a certain thought if you don't have a word for it in your mind, right? And so it's kind of a really like meta thing to think about, right? And that's why people who say, I've learned multiple languages, like you realize why it's so valuable, because it actually changed the way you think about the world and your capacity to understand the world. So, I think that how we to your point, Julian, like we're coding in language models. So language models are going to be really important. The philosophy of language is really important in terms of what kind of outcomes can result from that. And So that's I think just like a big question. And I'm not that smart about this stuff. Like this is like semiotics, philosophy of language, and like deep, like AI type of research stuff that, but it's again where I think bringing in philosophers, spiritual leaders is important, because there's a bridge there between like what is the possibility of consciousness, how does language give rise to that, and how can we build these models to be to not have certain shadows, because every language has a shadow of some kind, right? Missing things that it doesn't lend itself as much to. So that's kind of like one just musing on that. And then kind of more practically, there's actually I probably can grab it real quick. There's a book. This author is like one of my favorite authors, Robert Anton Wilson. He's an amazing book called Prometheus Rising. Like if you want to change the way you think a bit, just like Prometheus Rising is an amazing book. But this is another book he has called Quantum Psychology. And what it's just kind of like a fun book for me, but what the whole book is sort of about, like language is a lie on some level, because and so he takes a lot of like truths from that have been realized through quantum physics research and applies them to language, and shows like the way you phrased that is actually total bullshit. Is like not real. It's not true. So simple things like the fact that we constantly phrase, that is the water jug. That is the water jug, right? Saying is actually like a false statement. There's not an isness to it. It's actually it's a subjective expression. It's a bunch of molecules put together in a certain way that we then call water jug or chair, right? But at what point, like if I cut off one leg of the chair, is it still a chair? Or when does it become not a chair anymore? So it actually isn't a chair, right? But what's cool about it is like that's a very kind of like, oh, I smoked weed and I had that thought kind of idea, right? But what's interesting about the book is how he actually kind of suggests like there's different ways of phrasing that actually are more honest to some of the realities of the universe. And that's a very interesting inquiry for everybody, I think, to participate in. It's like, how do we align an integrity more with the truth of laws of the universe? And because it's good, it gives rise to flourishing, it gives rise to spiritual development. So that was kind
I
of like
like
a
the
fun thing that came up, like how
because for one,
yeah.
I definitely love Robert Anton Wilson. I've literally read his books, and I'm like, how is he speaking to me and fucking with my mind while I'm reading his book? It escapes my capacity of understanding. But then you're pointing at something that is very true in any intercultural exchange, and that's kind of where traditions, cultures, and having a shared history is really relevant. Of course, we meet in English these days, but the whole world has so many languages, and all of them are wrestling with this exact phenomena of how do we describe the potentiality of what is real into what is in front of us. And so to a degree, we need to have different language approaches and cultural approaches into what we're building. Hope you were about to take it away as well. I loved all of this. This has been such a deep conversation.
I have to say, I think a lot about language and some of the huge shifts that we're facing, and in some cases coming back to ourselves as humans. I'm also thinking about being without language and our felt sense. And Serj, you're talking about empathy, and you're talking about trust and vulnerability, to trust and be in connection and relationship with people. I wonder, in both of your work, or all three of you, do you have opportunities to just be, to just not go where the language is, to just kind of sit? We were talking, Seth, a lot about wanting more philosophers, teachers, mentors, but I do sense that we have a lot within if we can be. And I'm curious to hear. And also the word love can't help but rumble up from my depths. And where does love fit in with AI and these questions we're facing? Where does being with love as humans?
Seth, do you want to have a stab?
Yeah, sure. Like, because this for me as an entrepreneur who has a lot of this creative, like, I want to do something energy, like,
Quite masculine.
yeah, like I really, I was born like crazy like that, like running all over, climbing up the walls, like climbing trees, like everything. Like I have a lot of that energy. And I would be probably a very angry person, I would say, on some level, if I didn't learn how to meditate properly, because that energy can become fierce if it's not soothed and brought to some tranquility and transformed. And I had to deal with that as a child. Like I had a punching bag because I was like, I just have so much fucking energy, like, got to express something. But for me, so meditation, like finding those spaces is the only way that I've like to actually channel things that I want to channel. I don't want to create anything from anger. I don't want to create anything from, any kind of lower emotional states. So I have my own practice with that, right? Like the other side of my office is a different room. It's my altar room, which I call my office to the cosmos, right? I do my practices and meditation, and that's my computer to the inner world. But as a entrepreneur, right, I really believe that we need to open up some new structures and paradigms of how we behave as entrepreneurs in the world as well, because it's very beta brainwave oriented the way that it's been happening for the last several generations of, okay, we're meeting, we got to get this done. What's the thing? What's the next action? What's the next step? That's very beta brainwave activity orientation. So for example, with Dollar Donation Club as a company, like our first value as a company is get grateful, tune into the vision, and then ... So before we speak, before we choose what we think we need to do this week, it's like get into a state of quiet, get into a state of gratitude for what exists that is good, that is working, tune into our vision of what we believe we're working towards, and then speak, right? And so every meeting will start with a meditation. And I'm a big believer in interrupting meetings with meditations too. So and you can try this, like you have an hour meeting, at the 30-minute mark, just say like, no matter where we are, we're going to take a 5-minute meditation break. And what you find is like, because you stir a lot up in those first 30 minutes, when you let yourself have some quiet, that spark of kind of, just like you're saying, the divine, there's just a knowing. You don't necessarily need all of the external philosophers and all. It's like there's a knowing that can arise, and you give space to it to arise, especially for the introverts on the team who, for the extroverts on the team, so that the introverts can also express too when we come back. And so, yeah, I really believe that weaving more what most people would call like mindfulness, but it's really, these are just principles of adding spaciousness and insight and opportunities for more alpha brainwave activity to be given a moment to breathe, is actually like, how do you insert space actively, intentionally into otherwise non-spacious spaces to allow insight that's inspired to show itself, right? To sprout, right? Because it does, like you're saying, it's like, it just happens.
I love
It's
that.
like, you don't need to control all of it. Like, let it, and that's always the case. Like the best ideas I've ever had were when I was not in a meeting doing something like active. It was, I'm driving, I'm like walking, it's like, boom, I just got it, right? It just sprouted out of the space. So, music doesn't exist without the space between the notes. And it's the same thing in entrepreneurship and creation and art is like you have to breathe, you have to allow, you have to let the energy of inspiration show itself. And that's not typically expressed in entrepreneurship, but it can be. And we experiment. This has been like an experiment for the last 8 years for me as a leader, as a founder. How do we build a culture that is capable of birthing real inspiration and not just this is what has to be done, like that. Like it's a different type of farming, it's a different type of gardening, right? And it's more diverse, it's more allowing of the beauty of like, I didn't know this flower was going to pop out here, but damn, it's beautiful, right?
How
Yeah.
fortunate your team is to have that. What a way to flourish a culture, Seth. And I have not met you yet in person, but I have been fortunate to drop into those spaces of, I think, Serj, the first time I met you, you were speaking at an event and there was a lot of people speaking, and you came up and you sat quietly and you waited till everyone was quiet, and then you started a meditation. I think you might have even cried. You felt such a strong sense of being. You brought everybody's being into the room together. There were young people, there were older people. I was so touched and had this feeling of deep trust and presence with you that now I feel, I haven't known you for that long, but I feel like I saw you. I really saw you, and other people saw you, and that takes bravery to do as humans. And Julian, we entered into a ceremony with a few, a small group of people. And when you can do that, the connections and culture that you can bring, the trust that emerges, it's profound. Yeah.
Serj, do you want to share about that experience? I felt like we just all remembered that together for a second.
Yeah, no, I was just leaving some space. Yeah, I guess. I want to talk about space, but I also want to talk about something about flow. I think space. One quick comment on space, which I really like in work culture at least, is some of the best labs of scientists and sort of intellectual circles is just going for a walk. You know, grab that person that you might be a future collaborator. Don't get them on a one-on-one Zoom call. Like, say we're going for a walk and we're going to go walk through the park and we're going to spend half a day. Not everyone gets this luxury, but I find that space to be highly generative. Like, go find someone that you think there might be a collaboration with and just like walk for 6 hours, sit down at coffee shops, don't think about the direction, just walk. So this is something where, to your point, Seth, of like the good ideas come when you just lie down and, you build up all that sort of pressure at the screen and you collapse your awareness, and then just go for a walk, lie on the grass with them and start talking about, potential projects. That's where the magic starts happening. And, great labs do this. They'll go for a walk and then come back to the lab and then they'll have the solution to their equation. So walks are super powerful. Do more walks. Connected to space is also some freaky stuff that I've been looking at with flow. So I used to look at flow in the context of virtuosity with music software and musical instruments. And there's been papers recently on top performers, opera singers, instrumentalists, soloists, who once they drop into their flow state and they're like in the pocket, right? They're in their space. They're blurring that line between, outside and inside. The sound from this violin is going into everyone's eardrums, or this opera singer is singing to the whole room and filling the space with their vocal projection, that they'll unlock sort of mystical or even sort of spiritual states in the crowd. So there have been repeat instances of opera singers getting into their flow state, and then the whole room will start crying. And it's not because like, oh, I just heard them and I'll mimic them. There's something very odd, deeper happening there. And I think watching other people in their flow states as well is very interesting, and to the point of like why I try to start some meetings with a meditation and just be like, hey, let's check in, let's drop in. When everybody's in that flow state, real magic starts to happen. Not you running off at your desk over here and being like, oh, well, like, what should we work on? Are you doing that task? I'm going to work on that task, right? Flow states in football teams, flow states in sports teams, flow states in opera singers. I think this is really powerful stuff as well if you can get your
Flow
team
states in motherhood.
in
That's
motherhood.
where it all
Right?
starts. It starts with our nervous system. Literally, that's where we get it. We sync up to the mother or parent we're with most. Yeah. I love that. Flow.
Maybe are you, Serj, familiar with the group Flow? There's a book guy named Keith Sawyer who studied specifically like individual flow, but then how do you create like study like jazz artists, like the moments where they're just you unlock this amazing sense of symbiosis of creativity. And like it's, to me, that was what was coming up when you were talking about it. It's like, how do you cultivate spaces where group flow can actually emerge?
Yeah, I haven't read that book, but I think I think the future belongs to small groups getting together who can unlock that flow state with or without
Love
tech
that.
leverage. Like that's who owns the future.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes.
That was a big one. I totally agree that the future belongs to groups that can unlock that secret, that coherence power, that flow power, right? Somewhere between discipline and surrender and space, where it just kind of emerges and you realize we're all in it together, like a jazz group of artists or a sports team. Or we had a Grammy Award-winning opera singer as part of the guests of this Luminary series, and he talked quite a bit about how to get into that space. And I'm just blown away by this conversation. Serj, Seth, Hope, what a delight. We have to wrap for today, for this one, but I want to wrap with like a checkout question. So we talked for an hour and 40 minutes or something, and so much wisdom was shared. How do you guys ensure not to take yourself too seriously? Like, how do you keep it light? How do you keep it funny?
For me, it's like super important, because I can get very cerebral and intense with myself. And also I have this other side that's like hyper playful, but I think that, like, going back kind of full circle on some level to some of the themes of, um, illusion of the world, that these are kind of plays of evolution of consciousness, the fishbowl, the walls of the fishbowl. Like, it's very easy to believe super concretely in the importance of everything, right? Because it feels so, consequential, and there are consequences. Suffering can be real, even though it's subjective. It's very real for the person who's suffering. But I mean, this is like in Sanskrit, there's the word lila, right? And it refers to the cosmic play, right? That this is a cosmic play that we're in. This is, if this is an illusion on some level, that, whether it's, do I see the color blue? Do you see it? Right? This is all part of the dream. And so, it's very important, I think, to not take it too seriously, right? We want to maximize human flourishing and we want to reduce suffering. But part of the magic of unlocking that, I think, is through how do we not believe too much in the suffering? How do we not believe too much in the existential, we're going to die, the world's going to fall apart, right? Because that's actually the space that helps give rise to the reduction of suffering. There, seeing through the illusions of suffering is the best antidote. And part of that is the playfulness, is making, not taking it, making it a little lighter, perhaps. And I think when you go for walks and when you stare at fire and when you kind of just tap into that field where it's like, yeah, this is a beautiful dream, right? And it is a lot of beauty to it and its simplicity. And so and play can be quiet, it can be internal, right? It can be the lightness of not taking things too seriously, or it can be this like, yeah, I'm gonna go just run around and kind of have this external play. I think both are very, very important and relevant, and to not taking things way too seriously. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd echo the same thing of just playfulness. I guess I'd weave in also. There's um, there's often a place you might be able to get to where you can kind of see that everything is already kind of perfect the way that it is. And, that doesn't mean to justify sort of violence that's happening in the world. But what's happening is both kind of a natural unfolding and also an opportunity to learn, an opportunity to step into that edge of growth and become better. And I think, this is definitely true for folks who, um, might be struggling with certain forms of mental health and stuff is, or at least my journey through this has been through mental health and saying, oh, right, I needed to learn these things. Like in some way I gave them to myself. Like I did this to myself, or this is unfolding for me. So thank you, and having gratitude going into that and growing from it. Another aspect of this is also seeing many of the things we participate in every day as like games, but a handshake is a game. It's kind of like there's rules and responsibilities, and we do these like weird little cultural things. So kind of just viewing the world as a set of games. It has a playful component, and it also has like a real like game theoretic component. There's like a realness to it and consequences to it. In a large sense, the economy is like a game, and so don't take money too seriously is another way. Like just definitely don't like let that be the ruler of your life. It's important, but like see it as a game. And another thing connected is like there was a sense in, I forget the book. Oh, it's called The Fall of Public Man. I forget who the writer was, but it was about back in like 1800s, 1900s in UK and France. There was a sense that like when you entered the public arena and you went to the salons and cafes and you went out to work, you were wearing a mask. And this was kind of a given for many people at that time. They saw like gentleman culture as like a mask they put on. And I think it's something we mistake, going back to Gen Z, who like their mission is their identity. And for business folks and entrepreneurs, it's like their mission, their business is their identity. Just to remember, like, you put on the suit, and you could take it off, and see that as a mask, and, keep it a game, keep it playful.
Well, you know me, Julian. I never shy away from opportunities to be quirky and silly. I think that's why I spend so much time with young people, with children. Keeps my kid space throbbing inside. What an amazing time we have spent with you both. Thank you so much. I'm gonna be pondering over the references, the books, your ideas, and also your presence. You too, Julian. Thank you all for being with us today. And as we all rule breakers dive into what's next.
Thank you.
This was super fun.
Thanks for having us on, guys.
You guys rock. Really. And your bookshelf it's perfect. I now want to scour and lean in and see what else. You look like you've got encyclopedias back there too.
That's a series from like of like philosophers, and I think it's called the Great Books. It's a Britannica series from like back to Plato and even earlier, and then all the way up to like Freud, which it gets worse as it gets more modern.
Right.